There we go. All right, I got all the field notebooks graded. All the grades are posted. You should have received an email. As I told you in the announcement, you should receive an email that details how I graded each category and how many points. So take a look at that. And you got any questions, make sure you talk to me. Yeah, and I graded a lot of these, so it's possible I made a mistake. It's possible I might have dinged you because you didn't have 3 references and I just missed one. So do check through that and make sure that you didn't get knocked points for things that you shouldn't have. Or if you believe an identification that I say is wrong, if you think it's correct, by all means, please let me know. We can certainly discuss that. That's the whole point of it. But for the most part, you all did a really good job, and I learned a few things, and that's always nice to me. That's one of the things I enjoy about doing the field notebooks, actually, is the fact that you guys do a little bit of my grunt work. You go out and you find stuff about these critters, and then I'm like, oh, I didn't know that. So that's pretty cool stuff I can use in other classes later on. So I appreciate the guys' effort and everything you put into it. Your practicals are graded as well, and those grades are posted. I'll have those, the paper of those, of course, next week if you want to take a look at it. And remember, your final is next week. And let me review one more time just to make sure that there's no confusion. Y'all's final, which is over chapters 32 to 34, is on the 6th of December, which is Tuesday at 2 o'clock. And it'll be in the same room. We'll either do it there or we'll do it upstairs, but I'll let you know. Before we actually get into the rest of the reptiles today, and I say the rest of the reptiles because we're going to talk about the birds. And remember, I've been saying a few times throughout the semester and a lot more lately that the birds are more and more being considered as just a type of reptile. And actually, it's kind of cool today. One of the things that I've always felt about mammals and birds when it comes to reptiles is, to me, in a very general sense, all right, not in a real detailed phylogenetic sense, but in a really general sense, to me, it was always kind of fish, amphibian, reptiles, and then it was kind of like a Y to me, a break in the evolutionary chain where the birds ended up over here and the mammals ended up over here. Although the birds are actually, as we're continuing to discover and accept, birds are really nothing more than reptiles. They're very specialized reptiles, and mammals are not reptiles. I'm not suggesting that at all. But what I'm saying was interesting to me how from the reptilian line there became these two very specialized groups of organisms, like the birds with the wings and the feathers, and the mammals with the fur and the or with the hair and the mammary glands, obviously where the name comes from. So it's always been kind of interesting to me how that works. So today what we're going to do is we're going to finish up with the reptiles, that is the birds, and then we're going to move on into the mammalian group and again talk about how what was going on was just changes in reptilian lineage that led to mammals. So, and I'll fill this in as we talk a little bit more, but I wanted to correct something. The other day when I talked in class and showed you this picture, after class I had this thing in my head. It was like there was something wrong with this picture and I couldn't put my head to it, or I couldn't put my finger on it. Sometimes when you're standing really close to the board that happens. Sometimes it's like everything sort of overwhelms you. When I stood back from it, I realized that the labeling on this is wrong. It's also labeled in your book wrong. The amnion is not what it's pointing to there, that thing in the red. The amnion is that blue, what's colored in blue there. That's the amnion. That's the tissue. Because inside of there, and this is wrong too, is the amniotic cavity and the amniotic fluid. All right, so make sure you, and the lantuus, actually, well, it's pointing to it, but that's the allantois. There's like 2 pouches here. This is the yolk, and this is the allantois. See, the chorion, that's where it was confusing me because the amnion was pointing, I was like, that's not. I'm like, are they trying to say this is the chorion? And that's not it at all. The chorion is the membrane totally on the outside. All right. Okay, so any questions on that? Let me jump ahead to what we need to start with today to take a look at the finish off with the reptiles. So as we're moving our way through the reptiles, we're learning one of the things that reptiles are doing is they're lightening the skull by having different openings into the skull, and that's allowing them to pick their head up. They're learning to walk, some of them anyway. Among the dinosaurs, if you look, the Ornithian and the Saurischian dinosaurs are learning to be bipedal, at least some of them. And at least among the Saurischian dinosaurs, they have those small, and this is Tyrannosaurus, folks. They have those small little front legs, and I always joke, like, what good are those? Well, the birds, which is a type of Saurischian dinosaur reptile, is going to learn to do something really unique with those front limbs, right? And you can figure out what that is. Obviously, it's the wings, but we'll talk more of that when we get into it. So lizards and snakes, crocodilians we did, so we are here, all right? So as I just said, we're in the dinosaur line. That's what people always say. Birds are the really the closest descendant of dinosaurs. I mean, they're not dinosaurs. There were birds around when there were dinosaurs. Okay, so they're not dinosaurs, but they are the closest, as you can see, this lineage thing, the closest of the dinosaurs. So the unique thing about birds we've already talked about is the fact that birds, of course, have those special adaptations for flight, and one of those are feathers. And we discussed way back at the beginning of the semester that feathers are an example of this thing's called exaptation, right? Which basically means that some sort of evolutionary innovation, some structure that develops, actually is beneficial at the time, right? Remember, in evolution, something's not going to happen. Some evolutionary change is not going to occur that doesn't, through natural selection anyway, that doesn't provide a benefit for the organism. And remember, we said that with feathers are pretty complex structure. So feathers didn't evolve for flight initially. They evolved for warmth. They're good insulators too. And that's very good because our bird friends are very different than the reptiles, the other reptiles, because they are warm-blooded. They're homeothermic like you and I. And that makes sense considering their really, really super fast metabolic rate. You got to have a fast metabolic rate. You got to keep the engine really running hot to fly. There's a lot of energy expenditure occurring in flight, okay? Birds are the most diverse of all the terrestrial vertebrates, 10,000 species of birds. They really radiated quite a bit in terms of species after the dinosaur extinction, kind of with the mammals again. So there's that parallel thing that I always think about, right? If the birds and the mammals, they were around during the dinosaurs. Don't get that misidea that the dinosaurs ended, then it was the mammals. There were already mammals around during the dinosaurs, but they were kept pretty limited. The dinosaurs were the dominant ones around. Kind of the same for the birds. And when the dinosaurs died off, when that extinction event occurred and finally killed them off, then the place was left open, and evolution and the competition was open for anybody. So the birds and the mammals began to diversify from them. But the interesting thing, again, about birds is their reptilian links. For example, they have amniotic eggs, all right? So of course, so do we. So that doesn't necessarily mean that, we're as reptilian as birds. But they also have scales. If you notice on the legs of a chicken or turkey, they have scales, right? And where else do we see scales? Well, we see them on fish, and we also see them on reptiles, don't we? So that's an interesting link. I mean, among other links, but no teeth or tail, and that is something significant. Remember, Archaeopteryx that we'll look at again. Archaeopteryx still had a tail and still had teeth. So Archaeopteryx was a bird, but was more of a reptilian bird than a bird bird, if that makes sense, right? So still very close to the reptiles. Or let's call them the typical reptiles, all right, the typical reptiles. Again, these are all reptiles. Now, feathers, where did feathers come from? Well, that's the exaptation part. Reptilian scales, fish scales, the things you see on gators, those mounds, those lumps, they're called scutes. Those are all evolved, or those are not evolved, excuse me, those all develop from the same kind of thing. And the thing that they develop from is something called a placoid. All right, now on the right, the lower right of this slide, I have a placoid. In this case, it's a feather placoid. And think about a placoid as being, well, you can see there it says a dermal condensation. So it's a lumping of skin, all right? And you can have feather placoids, and you could have scale placoids. You can even have hair placoids, which again is that parallel thing with birds and mammals. Feathers arose from a placoid that gave rise to reptilian scale. So a modification to a reptilian scale placoid became a feather placoid. And the modification, what occurred is instead of being a lump, right, or a scale, like you think about those scutes on an alligator, those placoids begin to grow up and make sort of like, if you will, well, it's called a papillae, a little finger-like projection. Okay, so now if that continues on, that papillae may grow and form, say, a follicular cavity. What we're making here, it looks like it's hair, right? Follicle, you think about a hair follicle, but we're not making a feather. The way they're made is very similar, though. So if you jump over to the lower left now, so let's take this growing papillae thing and give it some more evolutionary changes. Let's let it branch out, all right? And then let's let it have in the stage 3, say a central vein with a bunch of branches, sub-branches, and then maybe even fill in some of those sub-branches. But notice in 3 and 4 that even though they look like feathers, those feathers would not fly. If a bird had feathers that looked like that, they wouldn't be able to fly. Does anybody know why? In other words, the last feather there that I'm going to tell you, that's a bird feather. Birds can fly. Those are flight feathers. You can use those to fly. Why can't 3 and 4 be used to fly? Any ideas? Flight is a very intricate dance with physics. All right. I got a little picture up here of a bird flying. It's interesting to think that things fly, birds, planes. They don't fly because air pushes them up from below. They fly because the way their wings are designed, whether it be a bird or a plane, as that travels through the air, and you got to travel with pretty good speed in the case of a plane, of course, the design of the wing creates a vacuum over the top of the wing. An airplane wing on edge has a flat bottom and more of a, I'm a horrible artist, but more of a rounded top, right? So the air travels more slowly over the top than it does over the bottom of a wing, and that creates a pressure difference. There's less pressure on top of the wing than below, and less pressure means a vacuum. Mother Nature don't like vacuums, right? Mother Nature abhors a vacuum, and she tries to fill it. So a bird and a plane floats kind of into the vacuum or moves into the vacuum, and that's how birds fly. That's how planes fly. It's how sailboats work. Sailboats work the same way. A sailboat, all right, so if we have sail, here we go. There's the sail, and let's say the boat is oriented this way, and the wind's blowing, from, say, this angle. So obviously the boat is going to be traveling up the page, right? It's really not a matter of the wind from behind pushing the sail, which causes the boat to move. It's technically, right, physics-wise, it's technically the fact that a vacuum is formed up front here, in front of the sail, and the boat or the sailboat falls into the vacuum again, okay? As I said, with the bird floats. Isn't that neat? It's a subtle difference, but the reason why I went through the time to explain that is the reason why the last feather is a flight feather is because flight feathers, in order to get that negative and positive pressure, they have to be asymmetrical. And you'll notice that last feather, asymmetrical around that central vein. You'll notice that last feather is asymmetrical, isn't it? See, these are even on both sides. This one is not. Now that's when feathers went from just being something that keep you warm. So 3 and 4 would have been great for keeping you warm. Not worth a darn for flight. Okay? But they would have been able to keep you warm. So that would have provided the evolutionary impetus for them to remain now. And then later on, something may have occurred, and then something obviously did occur, and we get an asymmetrical feather. Now, before I leave the placoid things for just a second in feathers, I want to remind you what it looks like on a baby chicken or a young chicken when it's first born. Those little filaments that you see there, all right, maybe if we looked at them under a microscope, they might like something like that. Those are, again, going to become feathers. Those are extensions of feather placoids. But I mean, don't they look like hair? Right? They look like hair. So you can see in evolution, or you can see in structures sometimes, maybe where evolutionary divergence occurred. So something occurred in some non-bird thing that instead of forming feathers from this scale placoid, there were hairs that were formed, and we can see that even in a young bird, huh? Okay, everybody knows you don't give chicken bones or poultry bones to your dogs to chew on because they're hollow, and they're hollow because you hollow out things to make them easier to fly, less weight, right? You remember the the insects with the trachea. Remember how I said flighted insects very often have expanded areas of their trachea, air sacs, so they can float? Same thing, same idea, right? There's a lot of fusion in the skeleton too. There's a lot of rigidity in certain areas of the skeleton. So it's light but strong, especially in those areas in which you're gonna in which you need to anchor those strong flight muscles. Remember, that's what our skeleton does for us. It provides the foundation by which to hang our muscles on. So oftentimes we can tell very much about an animal and what it used its muscles for by how big the attachment site was. So if we look on the keel bone of a bird, and you've seen this if you've ever sliced turkey or chicken or anything like that, you know, the breast meat would be attached to this keel bone. Look how big that is. So a large attachment, and then another relatively large, relatively speaking, attachment up near the wishbone area provides evidence of large, strong, breast bones, right? Not breast bones, breast muscles, which you would need for flight, for the flapping of the wings. Okay, so we start to see, we see that as one of the major innovations that occurred to the skeleton. And interestingly enough, and this is some of that stuff I've talked about where we do a little biology detective work, when they dig up fossils of these bird, these intermediate transitional forms, one of the questions is, when did birds start flying? So we got feathers, but they're flightless. So somewhere along the way, someone creates asymmetrical feathers. When did this flight thing start happening? And one of the ways we can kind of pinpoint when that happened is by looking at the size of that breastbone, that keel that I first colored in. Look when that gets really big. So in the fossil record, in this lineage of these transitional birds, when the keel bone got really big, we're like, oh, I bet you that's when they started flying. Now look up above before I leave on the feathers one more time. Feathers are more than just these pretty things with these veins that are asymmetrical. They're all very intricately linked together. There's the main shaft, and then there's the barb, and there's barbules, and then there's hooks on the barbules. So that causes, and you've all felt a feather before. It's light and soft, but it's, if you wave it downwards, you can feel the resistance against the air. Now, it's also designed in such a way that it provides, lift as the feathers come down. Again, negative pressure causes them to float. But the way those barbs and barbules and hooks fit together, the air passes more easily through the feather on the upstroke. So as the birds bring their feathers up, these things actually are facilitated in such a way the air passes easily through the feather, or more easily, and then they lock on the downstroke. I'm always amazed by birds, right? Because I sit at the beach and I look at them and I go, I know how big their brain is. I know they're basically a reptile with a brain. And I mean, reptiles are one of the coolest critters on the planet, but we're not talking about higher cognitive thought like many mammals, right? And yet I watch birds fly around. I said they understand all the intricacies of flight. That seagull coming in, when he's coming down over the beach, he knows exactly when to stall. He doesn't want to stall 20 feet up. It's a long drop. He wants to stall, so he just drops onto the ground. And the way they ride the thermals and all that, just amazes me. You get lost in that for hours. Now, flight, as I said, is not cheap. And what I mean by that is you're going to have to make some accommodations to fly. And one of those, you're going to have to lighten the load. So birds, for example, have no urinary bladder. Females only have one ovary. And that ovary only is its a functional size during breeding season. So hormones, the same hormones that make male birds start to sing during the spring, the same hormones that do that also cause the gonads to enlarge in females during the reproductive season. Same thing with the males. Males begin to sing because the hormones and their gonads are enlarging. Well, the hormones are causing both to occur. We always kind of joke and say male birds start singing because their pants get tight in the springtime. It's kind of that way. Their gonads start getting large. You're going to have a very efficient circulatory system. So you're going to need no mixing of that blood stuff. You're going to need a dual circulatory, a pulmonary circuit, right? A systemic circuit, and you're going to need a 4-chambered heart. So you're not going to have any purple blood here. It's all going to be completely oxygenated blood. You got a higher metabolic rate. You can't run the risk. Remember, the 3-chambered heart in reptiles it's not a bad or a good thing, right? It's great for reptiles, right? Because reptiles don't have a high metabolic rate. Flying is a different thing. So birds and mammals and crocodilians, even though they alligators and that, even though they look more like your traditional lizard, they're actually very closely related to birds, much more closely related to birds. They have a 4-chambered heart, actually, too, just like you and I do, actually. All right, so that's a much more efficient circulatory system. The respiratory system. Oh, I'll come back in a second. Let me jump down. They're endothermic, all right, warm-blooded, just like you and I. Higher body temperature even than us, about 40 to 42 degrees. And remember from Bio 1, having a higher body temperature or being endothermic or homeothermic, maybe is what you heard it called, means that higher temperatures means physiological reactions can happen more quickly, enzymatic reactions, all that basic stuff you learn. All right, one of my favorite parts about birds is how they breathe. We say that birds we can say that birds are rebreathers of their air. All right, so take a look at that picture, that kind of crude picture of the blue jay in the upper right. Notice that the lungs are labeled, but notice that there's the trachea, obviously. Notice there's also 2 other things that are labeled there. There's a thing called a front air sac and a rear air sac. Now, you remember I told you that in living organisms that any thin, highly vascularized, that means lots of blood vessels, thin enough moist tissue can do diffusion. Right? Gases, carbon dioxide and oxygen, and they'll diffuse. There's nothing special about that. They diffuse down their gradient. So long as you make it thin enough they can pass through, they'll do that automatically. Well, a front and a rear, which is what a lung is, right? But a front and a rear air sac, they're basically the same thing. They're not quite like a lung, but they're the same thing. They're a highly vascularized area of tissue by which gases can be exchanged, all right? So let's take a look at how that works in birds. Now, I would kill to have this kind of respiratory system. I like to run. I do a lot of long-distance endurance running. And if I had this kind of respiratory system, I'd be Olympic, let me tell you. So let me show you how this works. Let's start at the top, and I'm going to be here. All right, so, whoops, cue. So what we've done is taken the bird, the blue jay above, and we're just looking at its breathing system a little more schematically. Down below, they've labeled it for you. The bulb or the circle on the right is the posterior air sacs. The anterior sacs are the other one, and that stack of stuff in the middle is going to be the lungs, right? Everybody follow me? All right, this is so incredibly clever. All right, inhalation. Bird takes a breath, all right? The air in the red moves not into the lungs right away, moves to the posterior air sacs. Now, the arrows that are coming out from the posterior air sacs indicate diffusion. Oxygen is being extracted from the air. Now, it's also happening in the anterior air sacs. We're just not focusing on that right now, right? Because we're following one inhalation of air. Birds basically breathe the same gulp, inhalation of air, basically 3 times. So they inhale or they engage in diffusion in the posterior air sac, inhalation. All right. Now, they exhale. Instead of the air leaving the lungs, which is what ours does, the air now goes into the lungs, where guess what happens? Same thing that happens in our lungs, right? Air gets sucked in, or air gets oxygen diffuses into the blood, carbon dioxide diffuses out. Remember, you don't have to have anything special for diffusion to work. You just have to have the membrane that's thin enough, more on one side than the other, right? Okay, now, so we got that expiration. Now, inspiration 2. So the bird takes a breath again, or takes its second breath. That original breath, the one that was colored red, is now, instead of leaving the air, so this is the 3rd time we're going to extract some gases, or instead of leaving the bird, goes into the anterior air sacs, where you can see what's happening again, right? It's not until that bird exhales the second time that that original blob or gulp of air that was in red gets exhaled. So they're absorbing gases there, there, and there. Man, I would kill for that. Can you imagine the kind of stamina you would have? I don't know how efficient our lungs are. I guess I could look it up real quick. But in other words, how much oxygen do we extract? But suffice it to say, it's not 100%. But I don't know what birds, it's probably not 100%. But man, I tell you, you could do some serious damage running races if you could breathe, if you could take in one breath of air and extract oxygen from it 3 times instead of us once. And we're doing it, by the way, you never completely exhale completely. So when you inhale your oxygen, there's still a little of that residual carbon dioxide hanging around. So it's not really as efficient as it could be. And it needs to be, right? Look at the heart rate on a hummingbird. Holy cow! What's resting heart rate in humans? You guys ever take your heart rate? What's resting heart rate? Does anybody know? Yeah, something like that. 1260 a minute. If you're a human, you'd explode. You'd never get a heart rate that high. And that's because these guys, I mean, they're one of the only organisms that can hover in flight. You got to flap your wings, boy, let me tell you. Okay, now you know why canary in the coal mine, right? Now you know why they brought a canary years ago before they had sophisticated sensing devices to detect toxic gases, the methane, carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide in the mines. And so the canary would die, and then the miners would say, whoops, time to leave. So do you now know why it was that the canary died before the men did? And I'll give you granted the canary is smaller, so it takes less. Yeah, there you go. Extracted more of the oxygen as well as the bad stuff. Canary in the coal mine. What's the name for those kinds of organisms that let us know when that usually first let us know the environment is changing? I used it before. It was one of the types of critters you had to put in your field notebook, actually. So it's a critter in an environment that shows us that the environment is changing, usually first. Did I see someone just type it? No. You don't remember what a lichen is? What do we call lichens in an ecosystem? Remember, lichens are the ones that if the ecosystem gets polluted, they usually die first. What do we call those? Well, they indicate something, don't they? And they're usually the first ones to indicate something. We call them indicator species. Remember, lichens are indicator species. If the lichens die in a stand of trees, that usually means that the air pollution has gotten to a bad level, even before the trees or any other organism starts suffering. So the canary dying first is the indicator species, right? All right. Bird evolution. This is really cool. Birds are beast feet dinosaurs, theropods. What we mean by beast feet is good old Tyrannosaurus was a beast feet. If you ever go to New York, or if you've been to New York, or maybe you have already done this anyway, but if you haven't had a chance, by all means, go to the American Museum of Natural History there in New York. And go, before you go look at the other stuff, and there's plenty of stuff to look at, and it's wonderful, go to the top floor. Go to the top floor where the dinosaurs are and walk in and just, you like drop to your knees. You're like, oh my God. And many times fossils that you see on display are actually replicas. They're not really the fossil because those things are rare. But like this is the one for the Tyrannosaurus that they have there at the, and this is an actual fossil. So that's actually the fossilized bones of a Tyrannosaurus that they found. Now, I don't know if it's a composite. Sometimes they put more than one together because you rarely find a whole body, but it's incredible. That's where I saw Archaeopteryx. It's incredible. Speaking of Archaeopteryx, actually it was a cast of Archaeopteryx, which was kind of disappointing, but the rest of this. Anyway, speaking of Archaeopteryx, there it is again. Remember, it was a flightless bird, maybe chicken-like. It had symmetrical feathers, so it really couldn't maintain any sort of sustained flight. Maybe jumping over a ditch, which would have been good for, remember we talked about that, but like running away from predators, right? So feathers could be good not only for keeping you warm, but kind of giving that little extra, what would you call it, secret weapon to get away from predators. Archaeopteryx, you remember, had teeth, a long reptilian tail, but it did have feathers. And the forelimbs again, right? The big thing about this group of dinosaurs, look up above there, we have the 4 or 5 of them, well, 4 than the modern birds. These guys are all about those forelimbs. Right? So Sinosopteryx, this is what Sinosopteryx look like. Small little critter. Unless mushrooms were really ass big back then. I'm not sure about that. Short arms, okay, I've highlighted in red. Filaments, right? So we don't have feathers. Now, it's not hair, but we do have those filaments. And they may have been used to keep them warm. Right? So that's the acceptation part. Velociraptor, we all remember Velociraptor from Jurassic Park with those big talons, right? Swiveling wrist bone. That's something you would need if you're a bird. You ever seen a bird fly? Look at the way, this doesn't help. This is the way their arms are basically moving. They're like ours. They're swivel. They're very flexible. Caudipteryx. Here's Caudipteryx with a little baby Caudipteryx. Maybe Caudipteryx. There they are. My favorite, right? Looking pretty much like they do now. Anyway, Caudipteryx had symmetrical feathers. All right. Not flightful. And then Archaeopteryx, asymmetrical feathers. All right. So again, Archaeopteryx had chicken flight probably, not sustained flight, but we're starting to see these asymmetrical feathers, and that leads into the modern birds. Okay. So that's flight. But when we look in the fossil record, we see lots of toothed birds with large breastbones. So that's what I was saying before. We see lots of reptiles out there, toothed, right, that have big breastbones. So they must have flight. So flight was going on, and it was I wouldn't say common, but lots of different critters were out there doing flight. Now, sometimes what happens in evolution is one little change, right? It happens in everything. It's kind of like, wow, what if we put it in backwards, right? And all of a sudden it changes everything. Like, oh. So that is the story of something, I love the word too, Alula. In the middle of the page, you can see a little drawing of a bird's wing, and there's a part of there's a feather. There's a feather that's colored in red, and it's the Alula. Now, if you look down below at this thing here, if we follow the evolution of birds, the diversity in birds, or how many different kinds of birds, and the preponderance of birds really took sort of an exponential turn right after Archaeopteryx when the Alula first appeared. I can't really see with my glasses what the name of that bird there, Eolulavis or something like that. But anyway, that was the first Alula. So the Alula, what's an Alula? An Alula is a thumb feather, basically. If my hand were a wing, right, my thumb would be the Alula. That's what it is. What does it do? Well, the reason why it made such a significant difference is because the Alula allowed birds to be have much more maneuverable, especially in low velocity flight. So when that bird is coming in for a landing and trying to stall, but stall at the right time, or when birds are maneuvering slowly, or birds are trying to do very quick maneuvers, the Alula helps do that. And the reason why the Alula works for birds is the same reason why on an airplane the flaps and the slats come out when the plane is taking off and landing. Right? You ever noticed in a plane when you're landing, you look at it and you hear that noise, you see the front of the wing moving forward, the back of the wing moving back. You're making the wing bigger. Bigger means more lift. You need more lift if you have less speed. My old vertebrate zoology teacher in college used to always say about birds, if you don't have altitude, you need speed. If you don't have speed, you need altitude. So when you're coming down, when a plane is landing and they're slowing down that big plane, you need a lot of lift. But when you get up in altitude and you're flying, that slats and those flats actually become drag, so you want to bring them in. The Alula does the same thing. And then birds were like, ah, look at this sustained, maneuverable, controllable flight, especially at low speeds. Made the big difference. Isn't that cool? That little tiny feather, that thumb feather, Alula. I wish I was young enough to have kids again. I'd name one of my kids Alula. I think that's a cool word. All right. Oh, there's Archaeopteryx, right? Oh, look at the. I didn't notice this till earlier this morning in my class. Those are ginkgos. I did notice in the picture they put ginkgos. Okay, let's look at different types of birds, orders of birds. Now, there are several orders of birds. As a matter of fact, 24 orders of birds. I don't expect you to know all of them, but I do want to point out a couple of interesting or significant ones. And the first one that I want to point out is a mouthful to say. It's the Struthithioniformes. Struthithioniformes, or the ratites. Flightless birds. Flightless birds. So no big sternal keel, right? No big breastbone. That's how if you were looking in the fossil record, you'd say, oh, that must be a flightless bird. These are the ground birds. These are the most ancient. We're talking about the rhea, the ostrich, and the emu. What's also, and I guess why I put these in here is because they are unique among birds. They're big, strong, fast birds, but they don't need to fly. They can run like crazy and kick the crap out of you too, especially ostrich. But they're also, their distribution today, South America, Africa, and Australia, is similar to what the lungfish. Remember I was telling you lungfish are found in the same place, and the reason why is we think that at one time their distribution was scattered over Gondwana land when it was all united before the continents separated. Now, I bring this up to you because, well, I want to confuse you one more time before the semester is over. If I had said, why do these three birds in these three different areas look alike? Yeah, they are. All of them are. Ostriches are too. You might have been tempted to tell me convergent evolution, right? Right? You hear what I said? If I said, hey, guys, why do those three birds all look alike? You might have been, yeah, and that would have been a very reasonable guess. Not always the case. In this case, the similarities in these birds has something to do with the fact that they're found in similar habitats, okay? But it also has something to do with the fact that at one time, they're probably of a large group of birds that extended over these areas, and they just kind of drifted with the continents, which they would have changed during that time too, right? There ain't no easy answers in all this, folks, and that's the best part about it because it never gets boring. I love penguins. Spicenseriformes, they fly in water. Ever watch a penguin when they're swimming underwater? They're basically flying, so they're birds in a different medium. That's what I always think about penguins. Oh my God, the penguin exhibit at SeaWorld, though, used to smell so awful. Such high ammonia in their droppings, and they would occasionally have to rip out all the carpeting in that place and just replace it because they couldn't clean it. It would just get into everything. The people who worked there said it would soak into their clothes, into their hair. Not, the smell would. They weren't getting soaked in bird urine. The big group of birds, over half of them, 60%, are the perching or the songbirds. They're songbirds because they're the ones that sing. Not all birds sing. Perching, because they're unique in the way their foot is put together. See down below? They actually have a rear-facing digit called a hallux, and that's used for wrapping it around things. If you ever held a bird in your finger, a perching bird, you know exactly how they do it, right? They wrap the digits 2 through 4 around the front and wrap that hallux around the back. And they're very good at balance. That's how they're able to stay on the wires. If you ever notice, I was thinking about this the other day. Next time you see a bunch of birds on a line, especially if they're all the same species, if you can tell, notice how they line up on a phone line. It's a very set distance between them. There is some, but there's not a lot of variability. I bet you if you measured all that, you'd find on average there's an average distance birds sit away from each other. So birds have a personal space, I guess. I wonder if that varies by species to species too. Maybe that's what it is. Maybe penguins just need to flap their all along. This cartoon always kind of reminds me of, what if you spent all your life being some way and you realized you could have been something different? All I had to do was flap my wings a little bit harder. All right, a couple of quick birds that we're all familiar with. The cardinal, not to be confused with the Roman Catholic cardinal. The red-shouldered hawk, people say, how do you tell the difference between them? Well, the red-tailed hawk has a red tail. This is the cree, cree, cree. I have one in my backyard. He's been there forever. Very cool. When Cooper was younger, I always thought he'd give a little look at the dog. My wife said, do you think he has it as a puppy? Yeah, he might. Cooper was like all of 3 pounds. Those laughing gulls that keep you awake at the beach, right? Oh, everybody knows the mockingbird, right? But the scientific name of mockingbirds, I'm not going to ask you the scientific name of mockingbirds, but it is pretty cool. It's Mimus polyglottis. Isn't that neat? The mime with many throats. Glottis is throat. The mime with many throats. These are grackles. You often see them in parking lots. And you think, oh, 2 different kinds of birds. It's not. Male and female grackles. This is the male, and then the female up here. The blue jay, right? Very common blue bird. That's the baseball team, the Blue Jays. Now, not to be confused with the scrub jay. Scrub jay, you might have seen. Scrub jays are endemic to Florida. They're only found in Florida. But also threatened. So they're on the federal government's endangered species list. They're a threatened species. They're threatened because their habitat is being destroyed. You can even see this one is marked. All these birds are being tracked. Their habitat is being destroyed. The habitat they generally like is a lot of, well, the nature trail on campus, had it been allowed to burn, it hasn't been burned in a while. But, you know, Wendy was talking about Pear Park. That's the type of habitat that scrub jays enjoy. And a lot of that's being destroyed, like everything else. Speaking of organisms being destroyed, this is the dodo bird. The dodo bird was called the dodo bird because it didn't seem to have sense enough to run away from human beings. And when European settlers or Europeans landed on the island of Mauritius out in the Indian Ocean in 1598, these birds would very stupidly, well, not or ignorantly, let's say, kind of the birds, walk up to them. And that's a big flightless bird. Looks like a big chicken, doesn't it? So the Europeans would cut their heads off and eat them. And in less than 100 years, they were all extinct. And so I think about millions of years of dodo bird evolution, and in, 90 years or so, less than 100 years, they're all gone extinct. So human beings have the capability to change things very rapidly. And when people argue, well, isn't that part of evolution? Well, yes, but isn't that kind of an unfair advantage a little bit? If there's bunches of us with knives, I mean, if you had to chase them down and strangle them, maybe they're a little fair. I don't know. Poor dodos. Okay, synapsids. Synapsids, skulls. Remember the 3 different skulls? We had the anapsid, the synapsid, and the diapsid. It had to do with the number of holes, right? So the diapsid had 2 holes, lightening of the skull. And we saw that like in some different reptiles. Now, among the mammals, we have the synapses. So that's the 1 additional opening. And the eye orbit doesn't count, all right? So it's all about the skulls. Now, this is kind of that thing I said, not all vertebrates are chordates, but not all chordates are vertebrates. Remember that? It's the same thing. Some mammals are synapsids, but not all synapsids are mammals. All right, here's what I'm saying in graphic form. This is, all right, we're following a lineage here. There's the birds. So right here, reptiles. Okay, so we're in the reptile group. We're in the synapses. These are non-mammalian synapsids that you're looking there. What's a non-mammalian synapsid? Well, it's not a reptile. Unless down here maybe you kind of are. And as you move up this or through time, and I don't know exactly what the scale is, this could be through a gradual or cladogenesis, punctuated equilibrium, but you're becoming less reptile of a synapsid and more mammal of a synapsid. Remember, we from the very beginning in our discussion of evolution, we threw up like the horse and the donkey, all the gray areas, right? It's not like one day something happens and bing, there shall be mammals, right? It didn't happen that way. There were in all those transitional forms along the way. So we have all these synapsids through time. See, remember the other day I talked about the therapsid reptiles, and I showed you one looked like a rat. It's like some rodent, didn't it? Now, eventually where we get to, and our last group of critters we're going to talk to is up in the upper right in the red. We're going to get to the three groups of mammals around today. The three groups of mammals are the monotremes, which I'd be willing to bet, unless you've seen one at a zoo, you've probably never seen one. You have seen marsupials. We have one North American marsupial, often found dead on the side of the road. And then, of course, the rest of us are placental mammals. All right, now we'll get into those in just a second, but let's see what makes a mammal a mammal. I'm sure most of you know mammals have hair, but there's many other things. Mammals are relatively specialized critters, so there's not a lot of diversity, especially among the vertebrates. Only about 5,000 species, and most of those are rodents and bats and little mammals, shrews, moles, things that live underground. So again, it is the hair, which is a filament again. Same thing that we saw back there with the birds, right? A keratin-rich filament. Now it functions, same thing, insulation, camouflage, sensory structures. Cooper's whiskers there, they use their whiskers to sense, of their environment. Cats will use their whiskers to sense when they're crawling through small areas. Killer whale calves have rostral hairs, little hairs on their nose, and they'll use that when their vision isn't good right after they're first born to sense where they are in relation to the mother. If you're a porcupine, woohoo! Porcupines can't throw their quills, by the way. But no, in spite of what you've seen in the cartoons, they don't throw their quills. They don't need to. You get close enough and you get a porcupine quill, you'll back off. That's just a hair. Polar bear hairs are actually hollow inside. Polar bear hairs are very good at insulation. So, all right, now the big thing about mammals, where the name comes from, of course, are the mammary glands, which is what that young killer whale calf is doing, right? Look at down below. Those are harp seals, H-A-R-P. Now, weaning is when the mother no longer will provide sustenance or milk for the offspring, and the weaning occurs in these animals in about 2 weeks, about 12 days. Pups gain somewhere around 5 pounds, 2.5 kilograms, 5 pounds a day. Basically, the milk is nothing but fat. It's like drinking butter. Talk about needing to get on your feet quick. It's a harsh environment up there. So among mammals, if you're living in that environment, you got to pump that kid, up pretty doggone quick. You need to get him weaned. We're endothermic. We have a 4-chambered heart. We breathe through a diaphragm, right? We're the deep thoracic breathers, not like the buccal breathers that we saw in the amphibians. And being that we're that way, we can, not like the birds, but we can extract a decent amount of oxygen, so we can have higher metabolic rates. Now, as far as birth goes, there's a big difference. We have a placenta, right? Placenta is the interface between the mother and the offspring, provides nutrition, gets rid of waste products, and if you look at the picture in the upper right, you'll see it has the same structures we saw in the reptilian egg, right? There's the amnion, there's the chorion. Now, the allantois, the part where the waste is, the allantois is not pictured here, but in humans what happens is the chorion and the allantois kind of merge together into the placenta. Because the placenta gets rid of waste products, which is the allantois is where the waste products are stored. There's even a little bit of a yolk sac, right? Now, carrying that young inside, in addition to internal fertilization, which is common in mammals, or the norm in mammals, you got this sense of, again, fewer offspring, but more care, right? Fewer gametes, fewer offspring, but taking a lot more care. In the case of humans, you got 9 months of gestation. In the killer whales, it's 17 months, I believe, 520 days, 17 months. Okay, and we're smarter than everybody else for the most part. Some of us are. It all depends. I've met a few people that are rivaled by fungi. All right, what else makes a mammal a mammal? Well, we have specialized teeth, specialized dentition, depending on what we're doing. A dog will have, like you and I, will have incisors in the front, canines, not the same kind of canines we have, and molars. Canines in dogs, canines in those carnivores have a very, real and what Darwin called nature red in tooth and claw. Those canines in those animals are used for, you may have seen it on the shows. So when the lion takes down the gazelle there, or the wildebeest in Africa, he grabs it around with his canines around the trachea, around the throat, and grabs and suffocates the animals. Oftentimes when they find these animals, that's where the puncture wounds will be, right there on either side of the neck. Life's not pretty, but it's a most efficient way to take down your prey, especially if the prey is bigger than you. Deer have no use for any of that, so they just have grinding teeth. Beavers have teeth, of course, for grinding, and their chiseling teeth aren't so much for eating, but for doing what beavers do, right? Beavers are weird critters. I've never seen a beaver in the wild. I've seen plenty of beaver dams, but I've never seen a beaver. They're kind of reluctant, or they're kind of cryptic. Elephants did the same thing, except they modified theirs into a tusk. And of course, us humans, our omnivorous lifestyle allows us to have all the different teeth, so we can tear meat and chew vegetable matter and all that sort of stuff. Another thing among mammals that's, if you remember back from Bio 1, the mutualistic bacteria. A lot of herbivores have mutualistic bacteria that live in their gut that help them digest their food. Hooves, like this horse hoof. Now, let's take a look at horse hoof for a second and see if we can't equate that to what that might be in other critters. Now, we'll talk about it in just a second, but horses have basically one toe. So what you're looking at is the toe of the horse. Now, if you look at the end of your finger, look at your finger end on, and imagine your nail gets really thick and then extends down over the side, curls down over the side of your finger. That's what the hoof of the horse is. All of that is the nail. The meat, the skin at the end of your finger then would be this part. Does anybody know what horse people call that part of the hoof? Where the tip of the finger would be? There's probably an official name for it. No horse folks? Oh, the frog. That's the frog. So the frog is the end of the finger. Horns and antlers, the difference between the two. Antlers are replaced. Antlers, animals that make antlers like deer have velvet. The velvet is what provides the antlers to growth. Now, the difference chemically, horns are bone surrounded by keratin. Antlers are bone but do not have keratin. Okay, so horns are permanent, like a rhinoceros horn. Okay. And antlers are actually a rhinoceros horn is nothing but keratin, nothing but hair. Among mammals, the only ones who can fly are the bats, like the Brazilian free-tailed bat. Harrison, didn't you have a bat in your? Somebody had a bat in their field notebook. I showed you the bat in class in that display too. The patagium is the membrane that's between the finger bones. I got a job in college one time rounding up bats at UCF. There were a bunch of bats that were living in the educational building, which had a gym in it. So UCF was smaller back then, and they would hold graduation in the gym, and these bats would come out of the thing and swoop down on people and would freak out. Those little Brazilian free-tailed bats, they were nothing, right? So they needed somebody to go round up bats, collect them. So I said, yeah, I'll do it. So they paid me money to do that. They actually paid me, give me a little beeper back when they had beepers. They would beat, I lived across the street from the school. They would beat me that there was a bat flying around in the building. And I'd go over there and wait until the bat lit up on the wall somewhere, and then I'd just grab it, put it into a bait bucket that I had, and I'd walk outside and let it go, and it would fly back into the building, because that's where they were living, obviously. They were paying me $100 a bat to do that. So I did that for about 6 months, and made good money. They finally then hired a fella from Minnesota to come down, and he built these gates, kind of. So as the bats left the building, they couldn't get back in. It was like a you know what I'm talking about, valve, if you will. But of course, this is always something good about knowing about biology. They did it at the time of the year. They didn't realize the bats had already had their young. So when the females went out, or the bats went out at night to feed, the females and the males, they couldn't get back in, and the young all starved and began to die inside the walls of the building. So it stunk really, really bad. So it pays to know a little bit something about the critter that you're dealing with. Got some cool pictures of that. Now, mammal evolution, all right? Synapsid reptiles. Here's some synapsid, I'm sorry, that's a little therapsid reptile, a little rodent thing. Here's a synapsid reptile. Here's a cool little guy on the right. Here's a synapsid mammal, right? So synapsid, the skull type, right? And there's a reptile and a mammal. So we're along that gradation that we're going through. So these synapsid mammals, now the synapsid reptiles have all gone extinct. The synapsids have remained today in the mammals, and these all started to rise about 200 million years ago during the dinosaur era. All three groups of mammals, too, by the way. The monotremes, the marsupials, and the placental mammals were all in the dinosaur era. They were already around 140 million years ago, which is 80 million years or so before the extinction of the dinosaurs. After the dinosaurs went extinct, like the birds, they really went crazy, but they were still around during that time. Most of the time living like these little tree creatures, like that thing you see in the picture. Insectivore. They lived up in the trees because that was a good place to live if dinosaurs were down around on the ground. And come out at night also helped. They were nocturnal. Which is another little interesting piece of biology detective work. The reason why we believe these critters were nocturnal is because in the fossils they have very large eye sockets. Okay, so coming out at night would have made sense too. All right, now this is really cool too. It's hearing in the jaw. Reptiles can hear. Okay, this is your reptilian ear right here on the left. Right, reptiles can hear, but their hearing isn't as precise and defined as ours, as mammals is. So how did that occur? If you remember back when I was showing you the pictures of the snake, remember the snake, how it can totally disarticulate its jaw and swallow swallow an alligator, or even try to swallow a deer? Well, that's because there's a few extra bones in the joint. If you look at the jaw of a reptile, and the bones are named over here on the right, and they're color coded for it. Like the purple is the squamosal. But the articular and the quadrate are the two I want to look at, the orange and the green. See where they are? In a reptile, they're in the joint. They're part of the joint. They're joint bones. So a reptile, if we look at its inner ear, only has one of those three bones that we learned about in school. Remember, we call them the hammer, the anvil, and the stirrup. Well, they have official names, right? The stirrup is called the stapes. Reptiles only have a stapes. So the eardrum, insects can hear, right? But it's how well you hear. So they have an eardrum, and the stapes vibrates the inner ear, and they can hear. Not quite as well as we can, though, because we actually have three bones that fine-tune the sounds. So we have a malleus, the hammer, an incus, the anvil, and then the stapes as well. Well, the incus and the malleus, the hammer and the anvil, that's the old articular and the quadrate in the reptilian jaws. So our advance in hearing, our elevated hearing sense, is a evolutionary adaptation or a side shoot of the jaw, of modifying the jaw joint of reptiles. Isn't that cool? Now these bones move from the jaw area into the inner ear even today. In mammal embryos, if you study it during embryonic development, you'll see that as the brain and the skull and all the jaw areas are forming, these bones start off in the jaw and actually migrate until they become the inner ear bones. Not inner ear, middle ear. Inner ear, the cochlea. I should know. I did my 4th grade science project on that. All right, where are we? Mammals. Oh, groups of mammals. Now let's take a look at some really cool stuff. Monotremes, marsupials, and then eutherians, or placental mammals, right? Let's start with the weird ones, the monotremes. Most ancestral, they lay eggs. I often think what it must have been like for a European scientist to come to Australia, and look at a platypus. What the hell is a platypus? Is it a duck? Is it a beaver? Is it a mammal? If it's a mammal, why does it lay eggs? I don't know how big that coin is, but probably looks like the size of a dime, like little. They look like little jelly beans. They are mammals, but they're egg-laying mammals. It's a mammal. That's right. Right? They're oviparous. Remember what that means? It means to lay eggs. Now they don't even they do nurse their young, so that makes them a mammal. But they don't even have well-developed nipples. The young, like you see in the picture there, actually there's just an area that the milk it secretes from, and the young just kind of lick it off that area. They even still have the cloaca, like reptiles and fish do. Remember the cloaca in the shark? Right? They have one of those too. Again, land that time forgot. right? The other kind of monotrim is this one here, a spiny anteater. Same thing, lays eggs. Only place they're found too. Now, other more ancestral mammals are a little more widespread, like the marsupial ones. Marsupial mammals get their name from the fact that the pouch is called a marsupium. See a little Joey sticking his head out of his marsupium there? Now, marsupial mammals they don't lay eggs. They're viviparous, so they give birth to live young, but I like to say they give birth to the young half-baked, all right? Marsupial embryos they have a very short-lived yolk placenta. So there isn't a lot of interface with the mother. There's not a lot of placental time. The embryo then, in the case of the kangaroo, has to crawl up the fur of the female and then into the marsupium to continue to develop. That's where the nipples are. Like you see this brush-tailed possum, it's in the pouch. Opossums beneath have a pouch by which the young, they often are carried on their back, unlike the joey, which is carried in its pouch. But then the rest of development occurs. So marsupials are kind of same as us, except the young that are born aren't quite as far as developed as we are. Now with the true placenta, that's where you get the placental mammals. That allows for a lot more fetal development. Parturition, by the way, is the word for birth. And that must have been, or that was something that was unique and beneficial, because there was a lot of diversification that occurred, especially after the dinosaurs. So it's after 60 million years ago. But notice even 40 million years ago, even 40 million years before the dinosaurs went extinct, the placental mammals were still doing well. And these are the most extant, so the most widespread of all the mammals, okay? All right, let's take a look at a couple of different groups of mammals. We already mentioned the monotremes and the marsupials, all about the egg and the pouch. The sirenians, which are the manatees and the dugongs, no hind limbs, although we believe in the fossil record there are hind limbs, because these are another group of mammals that, like the cetaceans, went back to the water. Sirenians, elephants are actually relatively closely related, and if you ever seen a manatee when it's eating with its snout, it's a very dexterous snout. It's very much like a trunk. Aardvarks. I just love that name, aardvark. The lagomorphs, the rabbits, the pikas. I got a picture of a pika. I'll show you what a pika looks like. Jumpers, hind legs, right? The chisel-like rodents with those continually growing incisors, and they have to have that because that's what they do all their life. They chisel at stuff, and those front teeth continually grow. And then, of course, we come along with our opposable thumbs and change everything, right? Opposable thumbs, you can work tools, bigger cerebral cortex, we're getting smarter. All right, this is the human group. Let's look at a few critters. Capybara, the world's largest rodent. Speaking of rodents, here's your wharf rat. Wharf rats are found all over the world. They're very good at rafting. They're very good at floating on stuff that floats out in the water. I remember in the Navy, seeing piles of garbage out in the sea, and there were rats crawling all around it. Now, most times they probably don't make it, but if you get a bunch of rats doing that, that's why rats have spread all over. Down on the pier, ships, when they put out their mooring lines, will put rat guards on the line. So here's the pier. They're like large metal things shaped like a cone, and the rat crawling up the line presumably can't get around the rat guard. We had rats on my ship when I was in the Navy. It's just kind of the way it is, but they're very good at getting all over the world. The sirenians, here's our manatees. Now, unfortunately, we hear a lot about manatees and problems with boaters. Years ago, there was a push to try to get people to put shrouds on the propellers of their boats, because many manatees have prop scars on them where they've been hit by, they float right below the surface of the water. And even though I watch out for them, it's, if the sun's not the right way, you got to be really careful. That's why they expect you to watch in those areas. Manatees typically don't die or don't suffer mortality from the prop, though. It's the blunt trauma of the boat is the problem. So putting propeller shrouds on would prevent them from wounds, might stop some mortality, but it's the boat hitting the manatee, breaking ribs, and puncturing lungs that's caused the real problem. This over here, weird looking thing, is an Australian manatee, if you will. It's a dugong. And then down here is a Steller sea cow. I don't have a picture of it because they're extinct. Human beings hunted them to extinction in the 19th century. Kind of like the dodo. This is a pika. Cute little critter. Related to rabbits. There are no rabbits that look like that, but it comes from when I was a kid. My dad took me to go see a movie called Night of the Lepus about these giant rabbits that were eating people. That comes from the movie. My family, it's a big joke of my family that I have this thing about rabbits because of that movie. I'm like, I like rabbits, but if they had canines like that, you guys wouldn't think that was funny. Oh gosh, the dogs and the wolves and the carnivores, one of my favorite groups. I love canine social behavior and all that sort of stuff. So we could talk a lot about that. Oh, interesting group, the artiodactyls, or the Artiodactylia. Sheeps, pigs, cattle, deers. Artiodactyls are organisms or animals, mammals that have even numbers of toes, like this deer track. So a deer is an artiodactyl. About 15 or 20 years ago, it was always that question: which mammal group did cetaceans come from? Whales and dolphins. Whales and dolphins went back to the ocean. All right, so they were mammals on land, then back into the ocean. We were always curious. Well, which mammal was it? Was it the carnivores? Come to find out, it was the artiodactyls. So the whales and the dolphins and the porpoises share a relatively close ancestor with the other even-toed animals out there. So even-toed artiodactyls, even-toed ungulates, same thing. You see right there. And notice it's interesting that whales and dolphins, the closest, even that, is the hippopotamus. The odd-toed ungulates we'll talk about next. Those are like horses. They only have one toe. So cows and dolphins, relatively closely related, are cetaceans artiodactyls. Okay, horses, or those who have even number of toes, or I'm sorry, the odd number of toes, are called perissodactyls. The way I always remember perissodactyl from artiodactyl is I remember perissodactyl, a pair is two, okay, and then I remember it's the opposite of that. So perissodactyls have an odd number of toes, artiodactyls have an even number of toes. So while the horse is a perissodactyl, cows are artiodactyl. The bats, right, the only mammal that can fly, and then a bunch of the little ones that I talked about. This is what makes up most of the mammals out there. Speaking of bats, here's a cool one for you. We have bats in Florida, 13 species. That's what these are. These are bat houses. You can build them yourself if you want bats. That's a big bat. The giant golden crowned flying fox, Asarodon jubatus, from the Philippines. It's a fruit bat, right? And it looks like it's eating a banana there. It's like a small dog, doesn't it? You think it's a fruit bat? A manatee. The lower unit on your boat engine, Dustin. Yeah, that's what the skeg. That's what'll do it oftentimes too, you know. And like I said, even though you try to avoid them, if the sun's just at the wrong angle, yeah, it is. And they just kind of hang right below the water surface. A couple of times I've been like, oh my God, they're right there, and they'll cross right in front of you. It's, you really have to pay attention to the speed limit. Yeah, those are big bats. This looks like a doggone dog. All right, now the last couple slides, I very quickly kind of do a little human evolution thing. I could talk an entire semester. This is obviously anthropology, but what I want to do is in the context of you understanding that human evolution is no different than evolution of any other critters that we've been talking about, right? It's all a group of different organisms that through time rose to prominence and then went extinct, and there was all these branches that came out, just like we've talked about all along. And it just so happens that we ended up out here on this end of the branch by ourselves. We're the only human species out there. The Neanderthals, when they died off, they were the last of our brethren, if you will. Although there is some new evidence that keeps coming out, like Homo naledi may be an ancestor of ours that's more closely related to Neanderthals. So there's some very interesting things that are changing in human evolution. But notice once again, It's all very much like what we talked about. We're talking about the adaptive radiations of Darwin's finches or any other species that we've talked about. Now, if people say, how closely related are we to monkeys then? Well, it's not very closely related, because in order to make our way between us and the monkeys, you got to go back down the tree, back up this way, and out here to get over here to the chimpanzees and the rest of the other monkeys. They're very distantly related, right? Now, one of the more famous of these hominids, they call them, not humans necessarily, but hominids, was an Australopithecine known as Lucy. All right, now, Australopithecine is a type of hominid. Lucy was an Australopithecus afarensis. This is Lucy's skeleton, was found in 1974. Lucy was a female, we know by the pelvic structure. Lucy stood about 3.5 feet tall, lived about 3 million years ago. Now, Lucy spent a lot of her time in the trees. Recent evidence or recent work on the skeleton has suggested that's how she died, actually, that there are fractures in the bones that indicated that she might have fallen out of a tree and died. But a lot of folks could say that happens because of the age of the fossils. But Lucy spent a lot of her time in trees, but was bipedal. And down below is artist reconstruction of what we think that Lucy might have looked like. So Lucy might have looked like a 3-foot tall, ape-like looking thing that was bipedal. Okay. Now, one of the other reasons we know that they're bipedal, another really cool piece of detected work, is this stuff called the Laetoli footprints. And what the Laetoli footprints are fossilized footprints of a hominid, we believe an Australopithecine, walking. And you can see quite clearly that there's evidence there of bipedal locomotion. So imagine an organism, a primate, like a hominid primate, about 3.5 feet tall, being able to get up and walk on its hind legs. Again, the environment was changing during this time. It was drying out, so there were fewer trees. So being bipedal might have been more of an advantage because there's fewer trees, more open area. In open area, you want to be able to stand up and see the prey and the predators around you, right? But again, it's probably lived at night in the trees, slept in the trees, and probably spent, other than moving around. You can see this guy, he's looking pretty warily around. You're only 3.5 feet tall. So, you're not really too much of a badass at that size. Okay? All right, folks, I'm going to stop the recording.